Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to do our webinar on multiple forms of exploitation for victims of trafficking today. Thanks for all of you who have joined us today and posted your job titles. It's very useful to know. I'm pleased, as usual, to see a nice range of people who have joined us today. So I will start slowly with the introductions just because about half of the people have joined, so we'll probably get a few more coming up soon. There's mostly people who have joined us before, but if not, there are some who haven't joined before, so apologies for you who've heard this before. I'm just posting my email address, my Twitter and our website, so please feel free to have a look at any of those. Feel free to contact me after if you like to. This is our last webinar until I return after my furlough, when training will resume again. So apologies that these will be no longer. However, I'm sure by now you might be fed up with my voice, so it might be a welcome break for you. What I've done is I've just put a link to our webinar channel. The reason why is because I'm sure that not all of you have been tuning in every single day, but you'd like to break them up a bit. So the recordings for all the webinars that we've done are on our channel. And also, if you feel like some of your colleagues would benefit from hearing these webinars, then you can feel free to share that, and then anyone can listen. One other thing that I haven't shared before, which I've been asked to share, is there currently is a survey going around for children's services about how children are being affected by the COVID-19 outbreak. And we've been asked to share this form as widely as possible. If you do work for children's services, then you can fill that in, and it's a way that all the information is going to be tried to pull together, and then that's going to be fed back to senior government, I believe. So that's that form there. If you do work in children's services, then please fill it in, as I think often we can complain that people in government don't understand our realities and the realities of our work, and this might be a little way that we can help change that. So I'm just going to do the usual introductions. First of all, I think technical issues are reducing. However, okay, some people have said that they don't have sound. I'm just posting issues, the technical issues help sheet. If you still are having issues, try refreshing your page. It's a button in the top right corner. I've also heard that you may need to try different browsers as well. Okay, but apart from that, I am going to get going. Apologies if not all of you can see. Can everyone see the slides though? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, good. Okay, we're going to get going then. So, okay, there's one person who's saying no. If you try to refresh, then that should help. I'm just going to possibly get rid of the slides. You'll see me now. And now the slides are back, so hopefully you can see them. Sometimes that's helped as well. Okay, so just to quickly introduce ECPAT, if you're not aware of who we are, we're a small children's rights charity. We focus solely on the issue of child trafficking and modern slavery and exploitation. We produce research, we campaign for legislation relevant for separated children and trafficked children. I run the training program, so we train all sorts of professionals in issues of child trafficking. And then as well as that, we have a youth program. So if you are a practitioner in London and you work with any young person who is a potential victim of trafficking, then you can refer to us and then we will work with them. Okay, I'm just going to warn you that for most of this presentation, I'm not going to look at the open chat just because it does distract me. However, feel free to write any questions in. On my screen, it's at the bottom underneath the slide, so hopefully you can see that. Feel free to ask some questions and then I'll do my best to answer them at the end. Okay, so we're going to be talking about how child victims of trafficking will often be victims of multiple forms of exploitation and abuse. This was a topic that was suggested to me by someone on the survey feedback. I thought I'd give it a go. I wanted to give it a go. I thought it was a really good suggestion and something that's quite important to think about. But yeah, hopefully I've done it justice. So what I've done on the screen is I've just put on what we may think of as the primary forms of child trafficking that we see. So there's forced labor, child sexual abuse, domestic servitude, forced marriage, child criminal exploitation, and organ harvesting. And then what I've tried to do is just as many occasions as I can think of where there have been overlaps, I've linked them. And I think it's just really important to show there that they are so interlinked. I think there was very few types which are standalone. I think maybe possibly forced marriage is less linked to lots of them, but it is still linked in surprising ways. One example is that it is linked to child criminal exploitation in ways that you might not think. So ECPAT France, our partners in France, they produced a book a few years ago, and the book is called Realities and Fantasies, and its subtitle is Child Trafficking in Europe. And the whole book is a brilliant book, and it basically focuses on the issue of Roma children who are systematically exploited and trafficked throughout Europe. It's a really good book, and it's opened my eyes to a lot of exploitation which maybe I was unaware of or not giving enough attention to. But that is in that book, it also says how young Roma girls are usually they can be forced into marriage, and when they're forced into marriage, the groom's family gives a bride price to the girl's family. Now, this is often a lot of money, over 10,000 euros he was quoting. And then the expectation is of the girl is that she has to pay back her in-laws for the bride money that was gifted to her family. So there are occasions where that directly links into child criminal exploitation, because then she is forced to beg and steal until she gives essentially pays back this false debt. Similarly, they also report how the in-laws have also basically made her available for commercial sexual exploitation. So they'll say that she needs to prostitute herself to pay him back money. So that is something that I was less aware of than before, but it does make sense, and it is widely recorded in other parts of Europe that it is linked, and it's a link that we probably wouldn't normally think of. In general, child criminal exploitation seems to be linked to lots and lots of different things. So if a young person is criminally exploited, they are often forced into labor as well. And there is kind of a reason why up until the latest NRM statistics, which were published, that all criminal exploitation was under the umbrella of forced labor. They are very closely related. Last week, we did a webinar on precarious journeys about Vietnamese trafficking into the UK. Throughout that research, we found that not only were young people who were exploited in cannabis grows, but in the evenings or during their journey to the UK, they were also exploited for their labour, whether it's agricultural or in textile factories. Similarly, child criminal exploitation and child sexual exploitation are really closely linked. I've seen it a lot, I've come across it a lot, and I do think that there is a link there, a very close link, not only in the ways maybe similar to child criminal exploitation and forced labor, in the way that in the same research, Vietnamese young people who were exploited in cannabis grows, they were also sexually exploited on their journey to the UK, but also whilst here in the same cannabis grows. Excuse me. Also, something that we've seen is for children who are criminally exploited as a method of control, child sexual abuse is present. There are reports of young people who have maybe been intoxicated or stoned from smoking cannabis, and then they've been filmed and they've been encouraged to perform sexual acts on each other, on other boys, and then that is used as blackmail, essentially, of you got to do what we say, otherwise I'm releasing this video. I'm also aware of a young person who is in custody at this point of time, and he's in custody for a rape of another boy. And from what I understand about that case is that he was, I don't know how much he was coerced into doing this and how much this was of his own free will, but this boy his victim was running drugs, and he lost a drugs package, and he was not doing what he should do in the gang. So as a punishment for that, he was raped. Similar cases to that is with the Roma children, which I spoke about earlier. In the same piece of research, he explains how Roma children may have quotas on how much they need to earn a day. And he said that the reports that he heard were 500 euros a day that they needed to earn, and that was through stealing. And he said that if they did not make their quotas, then they would be punished through either violence or sexual abuse and rape as well. So again, that's another occasion where child criminal exploitation and child sexual abuse is so closely linked. I will just speak briefly about organ harvesting. Now, it's very unusual in this country, and in this country we've only had a couple of cases where it's been confirmed that organ harvesting has happened. That is mostly because we have a working transplant system in this country, so it's not as in high demand. However, in other parts of the world, whatever the type of trafficking that is happening, whether it's for sexual abuse or forced labor, organ harvesting and the taking of a person's kidneys is almost standard. It happens along the way, and it is very, very common. So I used to work for an anti-trafficking organization in India, and when people were trafficked from Nepal into India, almost always the people that I came across, they would have had their kidney harvested from them. So it's much more prevalent in other parts of the world. I have no evidence of this, but what my question is that we've got a lot of young people who are trafficked from North Africa through Libya. Now, a lot of these people are passing through war zones and are coming from war zones in the first place, where there is a massive demand for kidneys and blood as well, but there is not much demand. So I've heard anecdotally that as to pay for someone's journey across into Europe from Libya is that you can pay for it by giving a kidney or by donating blood. So that's just something I've heard. I've got no evidence for that happening, But it's a question for me, have our young people experienced this type of exploitation on the way to the UK, and we're not picking it up at all? Okay, and then around their side, I've just put other forms of abuse, which maybe are not directly linked to trafficking, but it is common as methods of control. Violence is commonplace in these relationships. Same with emotional and psychological abuse. Fraud and financial abuse usually comes alongside any form of exploitation if the opportunity is there. So, at the moment, in our National Referral Mechanism statistics, they talk about primary exploitation, and I think it can be a useful term, and I'm pleased that they've changed it to primary, and it's a recognition that these young people may have had several forms of exploitation which has happened against them. But it is problematic if we are just focusing quite narrowly on one type of exploitation. I think even though when we talk about it in this sort of format, or if we're talking about it in group supervision or something, cognitively we know that there is a risk of other types of exploitation happening. But in our day-to-day work with the young person and the narratives of how this young person is talked about, and the risks we're thinking about for this young person, we can often just very narrowly focus into what we know about or what we're sure about. And I think it's really easy for us to forget about other forms of exploitation, which are maybe more hidden or we're not 100% sure of, but there is some evidence for, or that we're not even asking those questions, or we're not even looking for other types of exploitation. So a question that I have, and I'm only asking it because I've had this piece of feedback from training, what I just mentioned about the organ harvesting, there's lots of practitioners who will work with young people who are who have gone along that Southern Europe route into the UK. Have we ever even considered organ harvesting for them? It's unlikely to happen, maybe, but it's something that we should be at least considering might happen. So, yeah, and as well, I'm thinking about my own practice here is over time we can get into a way of working with a young person, and it's kind of like a standard operating procedure, and we know what the young person or how to work with them. So we think about the same risks and the same thing again and again. And I just think that we need to be reflective, and it means that we can be less alert to other risks. It's something that I saw time and time again in youth offending, whether we're simply focusing on the offending behavior of a young person or the criminal exploitation. It can be really easy to miss the other forms of exploitation and abuse that are happening towards a young person. And I just think we always need to be checking ourselves that we are always seeing whether it's possible that other forms of exploitation are happening. And then the second would be about not fulfilling all the young person's needs. So for a lot of our young people, they may only have one or two risks here, but on their journey over to the UK, they have faced numerous different types of exploitation. So I go back to the Vietnamese research that we did. Most of the sexual exploitation that was reported happened along the way. There was some that was reported happened in the UK, but it happened mostly before. So we're focused on managing the risks to these young people here in the UK, but actually should we be, we need to be aware and thinking about what that young person's needs are from what they experienced in the past. And again, when we're dealing with immediate risks, it could be quite easy for us to forget some exploitation that's happened before. And something which I see as a positive shift is that in the police response to exploitation, increasingly you're seeing this recognized. So an example is that what used to be called the London Metropolitan Police's modern slavery and kidnap unit, that has now changed. and now it's a unit. I can't exactly remember the name of it. It's along the lines of vulnerable persons unit. So it's recognizing that if someone is vulnerable to a type of exploitation, they're much more likely to be exploited in another way as well. So instead of having a child sexual exploitation team in Sapphire and a criminal exploitation team or a modern slavery team, instead there should be a holistic response to these young people and these vulnerable people who might be facing multiple forms of exploitation. Similarly, I believe that Thames Valley Police now they just have a vulnerability marker on a person's P&C. So instead of having a child sexual exploitation code, and instead of maybe having a trafficking marker or something, instead of having to exactly name what that exploitation is, instead they've just got a general vulnerability marker. And I think again that is a move in the right direction, because it's showing that we just making sure that we're not narrowly thinking about one form of exploitation and missing another. So I've seen a comment about unaccompanied asylum seeking children having initial health assessments. Absolutely. I agree there are these looked after medical reviews, but what I question is how comprehensive some of these looked after medical reviews are. We are often not allowed to have very much information about what happens in these reviews, just because of sort of the confidentiality, superiority, or however you want to describe it, is that doctors hold and the medical profession holds that confidentiality very highly. In my experience, there's very little information that comes out of medical reviews for young people that gets passed to us. Now, the other thing that I'm aware of is that if young people choose not to engage in the medical review, then these medical reviews can be quite superficial. And it might not be that the young person just doesn't want to engage. It could be that for whatever reason, there wasn't an interpreter there. And then what it means is that this medical review could be done very superficially. So I'm not saying that it's possible that it would not have. So I'm just reading the comments again. Okay, great. Yeah. So, again, I'm not sure. I can't speak necessarily about how general practice is. I've just been aware myself of not particularly good health reviews for looked after young people. I've also been aware of very good ones as well. So it's just a question that I have is, are we confident that these possible risks are being picked up in health reviews? Because from my point of view, I don't think that we should automatically assume that this could be picked up. So I've mentioned it slightly before, but sexual exploitation, it usually it can come up in almost any other type of trafficking. So the primary form of exploitation may be forced labor, it may be domestic servitude, it may be something else, but it is very, very common as a method of control, but also as a secondary form of exploitation. And I'm not sure where everyone stands on this. Maybe I can try and quickly make a poll, actually. But if we think about something like county lines exploitation of young people who are supplying drugs. So these young people will often be forced to plug drugs in their rectum when they travel. Now, the argument of some people is that if a girl was forced to put something in her vagina or in her rectum, then she would be that would definitely be classed as sexual exploitation. However, why are we not counting sexual exploitation when boys are being forced to store drugs in their rectum? So there is now a move to think about, actually, instead of looking at people as victims of criminal exploitation, we should actually remember that they are also sexually exploited. And there is some move in police forces when they're investigating trafficking offences and county line offences for criminal exploitation, that actually they should be considering charges for sexual offences as well, just because they are being forced to store things in their rectum. So that is just something that I just wanted to put out there as a potential discussion point, is that I'm not necessarily sure what should be done, because on the other side, there is some resistance to this, because although the prosecution may be able to prove that that young person was forced to carry drugs, they're not convinced that the prosecution could prove that the young person was forced to carry drugs in their rectum. And therefore it wouldn't be counted as sexual exploit, or it would be hard to prove the sexual exploitation compared to criminal exploitation. So there are arguments for and against. I think it is a discussion that should be had, and I'm always interested to hear what people may think of that. And then also there's the issue of re-trafficking. So for some young people, by the time that they come into our care, we can do all the safeguarding procedures that are required, and we can be successful at this. So they are in a safe foster care placement. We've managed to break the ties to their traffickers, and therefore, we can be quite confident that the link between the original trafficker and the victim is severed. And at that point, it's possible for us as practitioners to get complacent that this young person has absolutely severed that contact with that the initial person doing the exploitation. However, because of the very precarious situation that young people are put in once they are here, they are in a environment which they are highly vulnerable for, because they don't get very much money in their allowance. Often care homes are targeted by people who want to exploit children. They may have a very insecure immigration status, which makes them worried and more likely to run away. All of these sort of factors means that young people, even once they have severed that link with the original trafficker, they are much more likely than other young people to be re-trafficked and to be re-exploited by totally new people doing the exploitation. So it's just something to be aware of, is that we're not out of the woods once that initial contact has been severed. And unfortunately, re-trafficking is very common, and it's something that we've really struggled with. I know at ECPAT, when we're working with young people, and sometimes it's years later, and we're very confident that that link has been severed with the original trafficker, but somehow the young people are being exploited again, or there's indications that these young people are being exploited. So again, it might not be news to you, but it's just something that I just wanted to highlight is an issue. This slide is from a report. It's a good report. It's made by the NSPCC, and it's called Free to Move, Invisible to Care. And it's about Romanian unaccompanied minors here in the UK. I think it's quite an old report now. But yeah, it's a good report, and it just, again, can highlight how individual children can experience multiple forms of abuse. So here you've got the frequency rate in terms of percentage about how many of these children in the study experience this type of exploitation. Now, if you add up those numbers, it goes way above 100%. I think it's even closer to 200%. And that just highlights to me is how common it is for a young person to have multiple forms of exploitation. And probably it's actually much more unusual for a young person just to have one form of exploitation against them. And then again, you'll recognize this slide from our Precarious Journeys webinar if you joined in for that. But it's just to highlight that same fact, is that on this page, you see multiple forms of trafficking and exploitation happening. So you've got cannabis grows, you've got nail bars, you've got forced labor in textile factories, you've got forced labor on construction sites. And as I said, is that what came out of this research is sexual abuse that happened along the way. So again, we shouldn't be narrow-minded in how we think about a young person's exploitation, because throughout the journey, they could have experienced so many different kinds of exploitation. So just a couple of examples, and then maybe I'll either finish it and open it up for questions, or people can discuss their own issues in terms of multiple forms of exploitation. So this example is two 17-year-old Eritrean boys who presented to a police station. Now they're in semi-supported accommodation. They've been in local authority care for 3 months. They go to college. There's no concerns with any ongoing links with their traffickers or who exploited them in the first place. But in the last couple of weekends, these boys at the accommodation have been there a lot less. And one of them mentions going to Hertfordshire. Last weekend, they were away from Friday morning to Sunday evening. So that is something that had never happened before. So this is a real situation. It is happening at the moment. Any ideas, and if you want to put in the open chat of what you think could possibly be happening here? Yep, child criminal exploitation. Very possible that they are being targeted and exploited for drug supply. I didn't put that information in, but we got information about these young people that they were going to very rural areas. So one of them mentions sort of a village in Hertfordshire, which would think, why the hell would you go there? So actually, criminal exploitation, it was initially what I thought might be happening, but the social worker who had this case, that wasn't what they were thinking. So I wondered if there are any other ideas. So they're in a North London semi-supported accommodation, but they would go increasingly, they would be going back and forth to Hertfordshire for several days at a time. Yeah, so someone said it there, labour, farming, exactly. So this is the current thinking around this case, is that they were actually being exploited on farms. And I think that it's been highlighted that this might actually be a lot more likely at the moment because of the lockdown. It means that the seasonal agricultural workers from other parts of Europe that would normally come to the UK to perform this agricultural work, they're not able to get over to the UK, which means that there is there's a very high demand for agricultural workers and not much supply at the moment. So I think even in our current situation, we should be particularly worried about young people being exploited for agricultural work. In this particular case, this was about 6 months ago that it came about. I will speak to you, Andy. I've just seen your comment. I can speak to you after. But yeah, this was several months ago that this social worker mentioned this to me, and I did direct them towards the GLAA. I'm not sure, however, whether this did happen or not, because this was something that came up in their training. Just another example. So this is someone that I worked with, a 16-year-old British national girl, has been experiencing sexual exploitation for several years. She feels trapped and like she cannot get out of this abuse. So on purpose, she said that she started gaining a lot of weight and totally changed what she was wearing. And this was to prevent her being sexually exploited. And then how I ended up meeting her was that she was charged for drug offences and drug supply offences. So she said that when the sexual exploitation stopped is that she actually began to get forced to run drugs outside of London. And this was something that she hadn't experienced before. So again, it's another example about how maybe we wouldn't normally think about might be happening. Yeah, so that's all I wanted to talk about today. I'm not sure I've done the topic justice. I'm happy for people to mention in the chat any other occasions where they think it might be sort of the multiple forms of abuse and exploitation. I hope that you have found it interesting. So there's a question about exploitation of Roma children. I'm just trying to remember the exact title of the book. So I've just posted a comment about that book. So I can't remember the exact words, but I think it was called, or the exact title, Realities and Fantasies Fueling Child Trafficking in Europe. It's a really, really good book. And after reading it, I think I've been a lot more aware of systematic exploitation of children from Eastern Europe, and particularly for things like theft. So yeah, please do have a look. It's not a very common book. However, yeah, it is on Amazon apparently. So yeah, I'm just going to do the roundup things, which I normally do. If you have any more questions, please post them below. So just to mention, we do training in normal times. This would all be face-to-face training. It's currently on hold, but please get in contact with me if you want us to run, if you're interested at all in our training, so we can come to your organization and provide tailored training. Alternatively, you can book on some of our training, which we normally hold in our offices in Covent Garden. So if you're an individual professional, or if you're from a small if you're from a small organization which cannot afford to commission training, then individuals can come on our training in central London. So if any of that is interesting to you, then please get in contact with me. Just on the screen are the titles of some of the courses that we run, but these aren't exhaustive. And then also, if you're interested in ECPAT UK, then please go to our website. All of our research is on there, and you can join our campaign, so you can